Listen to me. We don't want to kill any of you. But trust me, we will. Wake them up a little!
This whole thing is pretty much done. We're more ghosts than people.
You have got to keep faith. They will not crush us.
Good old Dutch. My best friend. You know how we met? Pair of hucksters trying to rob each other. Back in 78 or thereabouts.
You have to love yourself a fire. It's one of the blessings. Sure, we can have fire. And we can have the knowledge of fire. But with that comes the knowledge of everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a robbery.
Sons of Dutch. Makes us brothers. Sometimes, brothers make mistakes.
You'll never change. I know that.
All of you venerate savagery. And you will die savagely.
Get out here! Stay strong. Stay with me. You have to love yourself a fire.
The van der Linde gang was a criminal organization active from about the mid-1870s through the early 1900s, with roughly 30 members at the height of its power. Under the enigmatic leadership of the gang's namesake, Dutch van der Linde, the members committed crimes including, but not limited to, mass murder, theft, conspiracy, corruption, animal cruelty, kidnapping, torture, assault, arson, extortion, robbery, vandalism, mutilation, gambling, hustling, and fraud. So just some average citizens of the great state of New Jersey. For the sake of clarity, we're going to talk about the most fringe members of the gang first and work our way in toward the more impactful ones. After that, we will look over the actions of the gang itself and the path it followed. Some events of this history are dependent upon the player's choices, but for story cohesion, we're going to just pick one path and go with it rather than discussing every possible alternative. Massive thanks goes to the Red Dead Wiki. It's the source for a huge amount of this information, and this project would not have been possible without it. Also, if it wasn't clear, this video is going to contain basically every spoiler possible for both Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2, so if you've been putting off finishing the game for the last 7 years, I guess go and do that before continuing. That said, we begin with a man with no name. There's a story traded amongst the group that there was a traitor in their midst when the gang was in its earlier phases. According to Arthur Morgan, Dutch either killed the traitor or allowed him to be killed, which goes against his usual policy of withholding violence for those outside the gang's ranks. Next is Bessie Matthews.
How a wretched sinner like me could be given someone so perfect, so beautiful to take care of. For once in my wretched life, do my best. And then she dies. And I live on.
Bessie was the wife of Dutch's lieutenant, Hosea Matthews, and was a point of intense trauma for Hosea for the rest of his life. He and Bessie got married sometime around 1883, at least that's when the photograph was taken of them together that Hosea still carries with him. They tried to leave the world of crime behind after getting married and moved somewhere in the Grizzlies region. This would not last long though, as Hosea could not stay away from the gang and would eventually be drawn back in. Bessie stayed with him despite this and never had an issue with who he was or what he did. It's not known exactly when she died, but it was long enough before 1899 that Hosea refers to it as many years before. He was drunk for an entire year following her death and says that she's the first thing he thinks of when he wakes up every day and the last thing he thinks of as he falls asleep. Next is Annabelle.
Some things I can forgive, others I can't forget. What he did to Annabelle,
I can't do neither.
Annabelle was Dutch's lover at some point before 1899 during his association with Colm O'Driscoll. Through this association, Annabelle would meet her demise in a revenge killing at Colm's hand, following Dutch's murder of Colm's brother. This began a pretty intense feud between the Van der Linde gang and the O'Driscoll boys that would eventually end with Colm's arrest and execution. It was only with this act that Dutch felt he could finally say goodbye to Annabelle. Next is Jenny Kirk.
I loved Davy, Jenny, Sean, Mac. They might be okay. We don't know.
Jenny was found abandoned by the side of the road by the gang and invited to join. She was close friends with Javier Escuella and was the object of Lenny Summers' attraction, but there are no signs that she reciprocated those feelings. Micah Bell claims that he and Jenny slept together before the Blackwater heist and describes her as a dirty little thing and wonders if she could have been carrying Micah Bell IV. I would assume this just isn't true because, we've seen Micah. However, Jenny would be fatally wounded during the Blackwater massacre and succumb to her injuries as the gang escaped into the Grizzly Mountains. She would eventually be buried north of Coulter around the area of Spider Gorge. Next is Mac and Davy Callander.
Davy's dead.
There was nothing more you could have done.
The Callander brothers were respected by the gang and seen as reliable, if violent. There were accounts of Mac beating up 15 sailors by himself and snapping at some point, threatening to murder everyone in a town called Deer Creek. Assumedly, Davy was similar, as Micah describes him as a real fighter upon receiving the news of his death. Speaking of which, both Mac and Davy's deaths were also the result of the Blackwater massacre. Davy would die of his wounds shortly after Jenny Kirk as the gang fled, and Mac, who got separated at some point during the heist, was eventually caught and killed by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Next is Molly O'Shea.
Why, Molly, you are a cruel, heartless woman.
Dutch Van der Linde, I am nothing of the kind.
Then prove it. Prove it again.
I think she'd prove the earth was flat if you said you cared for her.
But I do care. I do care.
Molly said that she came from a wealthy family in Ireland, but there's really no way to verify that other than her word. She came to America looking for adventure and found Dutch, with whom she was soon in love. Molly was attached to Dutch to the detriment of her relationship with the rest of the gang and professed no interest in interacting with them or joining in any of the group activities. Generally, she stayed away from them in whatever part of the given camp that Dutch occupied, writing poetry or working on her makeup and just acting better than the rest of them in general. As time went on, her relationship with Dutch began to sour as more and more of his time was taken up with gang business, and she began to lash out at those around her. She became paranoid that the gang was turning Dutch against her, and this led to a physical altercation with Karen Jones, and Karen threatening to kill Molly regardless of what Dutch wanted. Molly disappeared for a while and only returned when Uncle found her drunk in a Saint Denis bar and brought her to the gang's camp in Beaver Hollow. Things got pretty serious here, climaxing in Molly's execution by the shotgun of Susan Grimshaw, something that, if not for Arthur, probably would have been carried out by Dutch. The specific reasoning for this execution will be discussed later. Next is Kieran Duffy.
Huh. You found a little shit, did you?
Yep. I got him.
Kieran was orphaned at a young age and joined the army, and does not elaborate on his time there more than saying that it did not end well. He joined a band of outlaws not long after, and all of them died, leaving him once again on his own. The O'Driscoll boys found him at some point and offered an easy choice: join or die. So Kieran became an O'Driscoll, suffered through being the bottom of the food chain there for quite some time, before one fateful winter day at their camp in Ewing Basin. It was here that they were fallen upon by the Van der Linde gang, and while Kieran was not at the camp at the time of the attack, he was captured shortly after by Arthur's lasso tutorial and brought back to the rival camp. They weren't too nice to him, but he wasn't too nice to them either. Once Bill Williamson got out the gelding tongs, he loosened up though and started spilling secret O'Driscoll locations. After a while, he started ingratiating himself to the gang and became just another member of the Van der Lindes. This did not look good on his resume though, because Colm O'Driscoll kidnapped him in the middle of the night from Shady Bell, decapitated him, gouged out his eyes, and sent him back to Shady Bell tied on a horse with his head in his hands. So I guess Colm was a little upset. Reverend Swanson took the body and buried it, according to Dutch's instructions, close but not too close. Dutch would go on to believe that this was a major catalyst in Colm's eventual downfall. Next we have Reverend Orville Swanson.
Have I been bad again, Mr. Morgan? I'm sorry. I wish I was different.
Reverend Swanson used to be a pretty straight-laced member of the clergy with a job and a family, but at some point, all of that started to deteriorate. He was consumed with his indulgence in what seems to be everything imaginable, and soon became the impressively mustached alcoholic that you see before you. He met a woman named Margaret during this time, who he married, but she was already married to someone else, so that didn't go over too well, and they had to go on the run from the law, bigamy being a pretty serious crime at the time and all. The law caught up to them in San Francisco, and Margaret decided to jump aboard a ship bound for Shanghai, and that was it. He just never saw her again. At some point, he saved Dutch's life, and it was in such a definite way that he was invited to join the van der Linde gang immediately after. But I can't find what exactly happened or what he actually did to save Dutch, but it must have been pretty impressive. He was a somewhat unruly member of the gang during his tenure, often causing problems and needing to be rescued from the consequences. As the institution of the gang deteriorated, Swanson did just the opposite and began to take actual steps to combat his alcoholism and improve to such a degree that he began to question the fabric of the group as a whole. In the end, he decided to leave the van der Linde gang behind and resume his theological pursuits, eventually becoming a minister in New York. Next is Josiah Trelawny.
I thought you'd gone to New York.
And miss all this glamour. You must be joking.
Trelawny was born in Cornwall, England, and eventually came to the US as a con man and conjurer. And he always seems to be walking the line between actual magician and low-class criminal with expensive clothes. While he is a technical member of the van der Linde gang, he just sort of disappeared sometimes and would be gone for months, showing back up in a prison coach or some other awful situation. But he usually brought with him information about future jobs and ways to make money, so I guess it's pretty easy to excuse the absence. Trelawny was the source of several of the gang's major undertakings, including facilitating the robbery of the Grand Corrigan riverboat. He was another of the members who chose to leave as the gang began to implode and took his leave fairly quietly, taking advantage of his versatile nature to exit without commotion. He went on to settle down in Saint Denis, where he had a wife and 2 sons, who he named Tarquin and Cornelius, which is exactly what I would expect Trelawny to name his children. Next we have Leopold Strauss.
You know how it is. People is happy to borrow off someone like me, but more enthusiastic paying back to someone like you.
Strauss was born in Vienna in the Austrian Empire into a family of extreme poverty. He had at least 1 brother and 1 sister, and I can't find anything about his mother, so I assume she was either not around or had died at some point in his early childhood. To give you an idea of how poor they were, his brother was already attacking night watchmen for food scraps by the age of 12. And his father sold his younger sister Anna into bonded labor to be able to provide for the rest of the family, which, I don't know, man, there just had to be another way. Strauss had nondescript health problems though, so he got sent off to America with his uncle when he turned 17, and they arrived in New York just in time for the 1863 New York City draft riots. His uncle couldn't handle life in Brooklyn though, and as soon as he saw the riots and the city literally in flames, he had a heart attack and died. So then Strauss was just alone and not even an adult in a completely strange land. He was a pretty smart guy though and started inventing ways to scam people out of their money, which he did for quite some time before meeting Dutch and being recruited to the gang. He became their accountant at first, but gradually built up a loan sharking business, using the gang's members as muscle to make sure they got their money back. There was no conscious selection in his choice of loan victims though, and they would often be honest people with good intentions who just happened to find themselves in unfortunate positions. This preying on vulnerable people would eventually drive a wedge between Strauss and Arthur, who would banish the accountant from the camp in the gang's latter days. At some point after this, he was captured by the Pinkertons and interrogated about the gang, eventually dying in their custody. Next is Simon Pearson.
A few cans of food and a rabbit. For what, 10, 12 people? When I was in the Navy.
I do not wish to hear about what you got up to in the Navy, Mr. Pearson.
We were stranded at sea for 50 days.
And you unfortunately survived.
Pearson was born to a family of whale hunters and had intentions of continuing the family business, but by the time he was leaving school, the whaling industry was in an irreparable decline and he had to find other ways to put his maritime skills to use. He joined the Navy for a while, where he seems to have traveled all over the world and often recounted the exotic places he visited, as well as some less enjoyable experiences like being stranded at sea on a plague-ridden ship. Overall, it seems like he enjoyed the Navy, but things went south a little bit afterwards and he got into some pretty serious financial trouble. On the run from loan sharks, Pearson found refuge with the van der Linde gang and became their butcher and camp cook. As the gang's structure degraded, so did Pearson's morale, leading him to become more and more dissatisfied with his life there, as they were forced to move around more and more to avoid the law. In the end, he was overcome by the bleak outlook and decided to leave. Sometime after, he settled down in Rhodes, got married, and opened a general store. He seemed to recall his time with the gang fondly, despite how things ended, much like his time in the Navy, and keeps a picture of the group near his post in the store. Next up is Susan Grimshaw.
I'm sort of busy right now.
I wasn't asking. I'm telling. My camp, my rules. Come on. Get.
Susan was one of the original members of the gang from back in the day, and her and Dutch were also doing a little bit of boopin' boofers, if you know what I mean, but he would eventually leave her for Annabelle. Susan kind of became the responsible adult of the gang, settling disputes, delegating duties, and organizing the setting up and breaking down of camp, and working with Pearson to keep the camp supplied and safe. She also made sure that as many members of the gang as possible stayed alive, like when she asked Arthur to go and find Tilly Jackson after noticing that she had been missing for a while, and even knowing enough about Tilly to tell him that the Foreman brothers were probably responsible. Things changed in Beaver Hollow, though, where Susan killed Molly O'Shea and would end up taking Arthur's side as the camp was divided over what to do about Micah Bell and the likelihood of him being the Pinkertons' rat. In this altercation, Micah mortally wounded Susan with a shot to the stomach, and she expired quickly thereafter. Later, Charles Smith returned to the camp to take her body to be buried on Roanoke Ridge. Next is Abigail Roberts.
That night, that fancy Dan from the old country tried to slip out on you without paying.
That must have been near 10 years ago.
You twisted his balls so tight, he's screeching like a plucked jaybird.
You know, it always was the fellas with the most money who like paying the least.
Oh, yeah. Tough as iron, this one. Ain't she, John?
I'm getting tired of your mouth, old man.
Abigail was an orphan who had to resort to prostitution to support herself and pursued this vocation until she was eventually introduced to the van der Linde gang by Uncle. After arriving, she slept with pretty much every male member of the gang, but would build an attachment to John Marston more than any of the others and become pregnant with John's son Jack. Although John was never able to fully accept that Jack was, in fact, his son. Abigail did not give up though, even when John was gone for quite a while when Jack was about a year old. She repeatedly tried to keep John from harm despite his hostility. She ended up being a critical piece of the gang though, when she killed Pinkerton agent Milton, saving Arthur's life. Arthur then took her and Sadie Adler to Copperhead Landing, where they would find Jack and Tilly. John continued his violent ways after their reunion, however, leading her to leave him for a time, taking Jack with her. She died not long after John, of unknown causes in 1914, at just 37 years old. Next, we have Uncle.
It's good to have the old gang back together again.
Let's just hope things don't turn out like last time.
Here he goes. What'd I tell you, Charles? Boy is as sour as week-old milk. No wonder she didn't stay with you. Not even a retired $2 whore would stay with you.
Uncle was never given any more of a name than that title, and, much like the man himself, its origins remain unclear. What is known is that Uncle was from Ohio and found himself alone in the world following the death of his parents when he was 9 years old. Uncle told a lot of stories about his past, and it's difficult to say how many of those are fact and how many were just fiction. One of his most extreme claims was that he sold camping gear in East Africa and was worshipped as a god by locals in the Congo. He also claims to have been the one-shot kid when he was younger, but given his tactical abilities seen in 1899, this is also a bit hard to believe. He was married twice over the course of his life, but there's nothing known about his wives or where or when they entered and left his life. Uncle really doesn't do much for the gang in general. I mean, he finds leads sometimes, but mostly just sits around drinking and complaining. But he did find Abigail, so that's something. He's one of the several that left the gang in its final days, becoming distrustful of Micah. Later, he met up with John and Blackwater and decided to stay with them as he tried to put his life back together, and actually became very helpful. He stayed with John at Beecher's Hope for quite some time, finally giving his life there during an assault by the U.S. Army and Bureau of Investigation. He was buried on a ridge over the ranch next to John, and ultimately, Abigail. Next, we have Mary-Beth Gaskill.
So, no regrets?
Regrets for what?
Oh, for joining this band of maniacs.
If you're a girl without means in this world, life is very scary. You boys cared for me before no one cared for me. Well, life weren't very nice, Arthur. Not after Mama got typhoid, and that was a long time ago.
Sure.
Mary-Beth was a barmaid turned pickpocket who was on the run from those she had robbed when she was picked up by the Van der Linde gang. She assisted the gang in many robberies, being a distraction at times and fellow conspirator. Mary-Beth was also something of a confidant to Arthur, and they would sometimes share stories of their pasts together that they wouldn't really share with others. She was also one of the only gang members that Arthur told about his tuberculosis diagnosis in Beaver Hollow. Not long after, she would depart the gang with a number of discontented others. She did very well for herself, though, becoming a somewhat successful romance author under the name Leslie DuPont, and even gave John Marston one of her books called The Lady of the Manor. As time went on, she would stay in contact with one of her previous fellow gang members, who we will talk about directly. Next is Tilly Jackson.
Let me ask you a question. If I was to kill Miss Grimshaw, would Dutch be mad?
I think, as a general rule, Dutch likes to avoid murder within the camp.
Tilly was the daughter of a former slave and was forced into a life of crime very early when she was kidnapped by the Foreman brothers. She was with them for some time before having to kill Anthony Foreman's cousin, who was trying to force himself on her. She went back to where she and her mother lived, only to find that her mother had died in her absence. Sometime after this, she was found by Dutch, who saw her as a wayward soul in need of guidance, much like Arthur and John. He took her in, taught her to read, and gave her a job, leading her to feel indebted to him, but also to view him as the sort of father figure she never had. She was pretty active in gang activities, accompanying other members on everything from shopping trips to violent robberies, as well as being a valuable part of sustaining camp life. Tilly was later captured by the Foreman brothers when the gang made their headquarters near Saint Denis, and Susan enlisted Arthur to go and find her. They did, and later captured Anthony Foreman, bringing him back for Tilly to warn to stay away. He said that he would, but his fate was ultimately left up to Arthur, with Susan saying Anthony should be killed and Tilly lobbying for mercy. Around the time of the Pinkerton raid on the gang's Beaver Hollow camp, she took Jack into hiding and is responsible not only for his survival, but also for his reunion with his mother. Arthur gave her a share of the train heist money and told her to go to Copperhead Landing. After leaving the gang, Tilly married a lawyer from Haiti and went to live a fairly wealthy life in Saint Denis. While she would sometimes see John passing through, Mary-Beth was the only former member with whom she would maintain contact. Next, we have Karen Jones.
Well, can Miss Grimshaw spare you?
Can Miss Grimshaw spare you? What's happened to you, Arthur? 3 young, healthy women want you to take them a robbing. You're worried about house chores. Let's go.
Fair enough. You got me. Come on in.
Karen began her career as a criminal sometime before joining the gang, but there's not really much known about her other than the fact that she was pretty skilled in both con artistry and gunslinging. This is shown very clearly during a bank robbery wherein she dressed as a nun and hid guns under her robes. Karen was the first to develop disdain for Molly and began the rift between Molly and the rest of the gang, demonstrated when she is confronted for saying that Molly thought she was better than the rest of them, and the admittance of this insult causes Molly to lash out at all of the women in the gang, basically confirming that yes, she thinks they are all below her. Karen struggled with how others viewed her and told Sean MacGuire after a camp party that she just wants someone to see her. As the gang deteriorates, so does Karen, consumed by both alcoholism and bitterness toward other members, specifically Susan, as she repeatedly decries her choice to shoot Molly. She eventually joined Uncle, Mary-Beth, and Pearson in leaving the gang and disappears completely soon after. While her exact fate is unknown, Tilly confides in a letter to John that she believes Karen eventually drank herself to death. Next is Sadie Adler.
I think you should cover me and I'll go in there and get her. 'Cause you're the better shot, I mean.
That ain't what you mean. I can still fight.
I know, Arthur, but just do it my way, honey. It's for the best.
Sadie grew up with a rugged lifestyle and learned to hunt, shoot, and ride horses from a young age. She later married Jake Adler and settled down on a ranch in Ambarino. A few years of peaceful life later, their home was attacked by the O'Driscoll boys and Jake was killed, leaving Sadie to hide in their cellar until the Van der Linde gang finds their house while searching for supplies. After the O'Driscolls are killed, she discovers Micah looting her home, and in the following confrontation, a lantern is knocked over, setting the house on fire, and Dutch decides to take her back to their camp. camp. Sadie went on to be a pretty valuable member of the gang, if a bit manic at times in her hate for the O'Driscolls, but considering they killed her husband and destroyed everything she'd ever known, that's kind of understandable. She continually pushed to be included in the gang's outlaw work, while also being repeatedly excluded by the other women in the camp. Eventually, Sadie got the satisfaction of revenge for her husband's murder by taking the life of the man who killed him at Hanging Dog Ranch. At their final meeting, she and John make a deal to kill Micah Bell for his betrayal if they ever found him. After the gang's disbanding, Sadie became a fairly successful bounty hunter, and that is how John found her when they and Charles interrogated a man named Cleet in Strawberry to reveal the hideout location of Micah's gang. Afterwards, she attended John and Abigail's wedding before leaving for good. What happened to her after this is unknown, although she had previously talked about wanting to visit South America. Next we have Lenny Summers.
Arthur!
What's going on?
They got Micah. He's been arrested for murder. He was in Strawberry.
It's okay, son. Breathe.
They nearly lynched me. They got Micah and the sheriffs in Strawberry. And there's talk of hanging him.
Here's hoping. Arthur.
Lenny was the son of former slaves and had no inkling of crime in his life, being the son of an educated man who taught him everything he knew. However, Lenny's father would be beaten to death by drunkards one night, and after dispatching both in retaliation, Lenny was forced to go on the run at just 15 years old. In the winter of 1898, he came across the Van der Linde gang while wandering through the Grizzlies and was invited to join them. Not long after, he fell in love with Jenny Kirk, only to be devastated by her death as the gang fled the Blackwater Massacre. Oddly enough, both of these events only made him more loyal to the gang as a whole. Lenny became a very valuable member of the group as both strategist and enforcer, and would accompany his more experienced colleagues regularly on their endeavors. This skill would lead him to be present at the attempted robbery of the Lemoyne National Bank, which would ultimately end in disaster. After being ambushed by Pinkerton agents at the bank, the would-be robbers fled across the adjacent rooftops of Saint Denis, but Arthur and Lenny were confronted by two Pinkerton riflemen who gunned down Lenny, killing him immediately. Surrounded by a hail of gunfire, the others had no choice but to leave his body behind. Mercifully, a contingent of gang members liberated his body from the Saint Denis morgue and buried him in Blue Water Marsh. Next is Sean MacGuire.
I love you, Arthur Morgan. I love you. Come on, take a shot. Come on, take your best shot, please, eh?
Grow up.
Sean was born in Ireland as the son of a member of Irish independence organization the Fenian Brotherhood. Due to his outlaw status, his family had to flee to America when he was fairly young, but this retreat did little as his father would be killed shortly after their arrival. Sean went to reform school, but that didn't do much because he went on to become a career criminal in his adult years, robbing and pilfering from whoever was convenient. Two of these people would be Dutch and Hosea, who he met at a North Elizabeth bar. He noted Dutch's expensive pocket watch and, assuming they were rich, decided to hold them up at gunpoint in an alley outside the bar. They thought this was very funny and dared Sean to shoot them, which was when he discovered that they had already removed the bullets from his gun when they were back in the bar. This went over pretty well though, and they decided to give him food and invite him to join the gang. A much better ending than if Sean had attempted to rob Arthur. Sean was another enforcer of the gang and would become one of their most important gunslingers during his tenure. However, during the Blackwater Massacre, he was separated from the others and captured by Ike Skelding's bounty hunters, who interrogated him for further information about the gang to no result. Giving up on this, they decided to hand him over to the law at a federal prison, but before that could happen, Josiah Trelawny found out where he was being held. He led Arthur, Javier, and Charles in rescuing Sean from where he was tied upside down from a tree. During the gang's attempted manipulation of the Gray and Braithwaite families in the town of Rhodes, Sean was invited by Arthur to join him, Bill, and Micah to inquire about a job working security for the Grays. They were ambushed by Gray family hired guns though, and Sean took the Kennedy way out at the hands of a sniper. This assassination did two things. Firstly, it enraged Arthur, who pretty much killed everyone in the town, and blamed Sean's death on Micah, beginning the wedge between them that would ultimately crack the foundation of the gang itself. Secondly, it hit Karen very hard as she had an on and off romantic relationship with the Irishman, and his death was a key milestone in her descent into bitterness and alcoholism. Next we have Charles Smith.
Why do you feel the need to talk so much?
Why you feel the need for silence?
I guess I prefer people when I don't have to listen to them.
Charles was the son of an African-American father and a Native American mother, though he was much more attuned with his mother's culture, having lived with her tribe until the army drove the tribe out of their ancestral home. His mother was eventually captured by soldiers and just never seen again, and this hit his father, understandably, pretty hard, leading him down a road of severe depression and alcoholism. During this time, Charles learned a great deal of skills from his uncle, who taught him average uncle stuff, like how to make poisoned arrows from plants. At 13, he ran away from home and just sort of wandered around, doing odd jobs until he eventually met the Van der Linde gang and the Grizzlies in autumn of 1898. Charles was like Arthur in that he was kind of an everything guy. He could hunt, shoot, fish, fight, track both animals and humans, make medicine, and pretty much whatever else the gang needed. Later, while some of the gang was in Guarma following the failed Lemoyne National Bank heist, Charles was a key factor in getting the survivors together and keeping everyone alive while they found a new place to hide. After the battle at the Heartland oil fields, he helped get Eagle Flies back to the reservation and decided to stay with the Wapiti tribe and help them relocate to Canada. He didn't end up going all the way north though, or if he did, he eventually came back to Saint Denis and started being a prize fighter. At least that's how Uncle and John found him in 1907. He went to Beecher's Hope with John and, though wounded in the confrontation with Micah, attended John and Abigail's wedding. Afterwards, he bid all farewell and no one knows what happened to him from that point forward. But it would be reasonable to assume that he went to pursue his goal of moving to Canada and starting a family, something that he talked about several times. Next is Micah Bell.
Go fetch me something to eat.
Excuse me?
I said, fetch me something to eat.
Eat that.
You want to watch that temper of yours, boy?
Much like many other members of the gang, Micah was born into a life of crime, the son of a small-time outlaw, and learned the craft throughout his upbringing as he and his brother Amos aided their father in his misdeeds. In the winter of 1898, Micah found himself in the town of Grimshaw Hills, where Dutch was attempting to sell some stolen gold and the deal went sour. Micah stepped in at some point and saved Dutch's life, which, as we have seen before, pretty much guarantees an invitation to join the Van der Linde gang. Nobody liked Micah, like nobody, except for Dutch. Dutch thought he was just a strategic genius and an intrinsic part of their money-making process, which, I mean, I don't think anyone will argue that Micah was a deadly individual. If you needed someone to teach the law of the gun, he was a willing and able professor. But as a member of a team, he was hot-headed, reckless, violent to a fault, argued about everything, and was just impossible to get along with. And for all of this, nobody wanted him around, especially Arthur, John, and Hosea. Micah and Lenny were sent out scouting while the gang took refuge at Horseshoe Overlook, and Micah ended up getting into a drunken fight with a man in the town of Strawberry, which led to his arrest and Lenny's escape. Upon hearing this, Dutch thinks it is so important that he sends Arthur, far and away his best soldier, to free Micah from jail. Of course, this can't just be simple, and Micah ended up killing half the town and they barely got out of Strawberry alive, never mind free. All of this goes back to Micah's terrible instincts for the job of outlaw. I mean, he was responsible for the Blackwater Massacre even happening in the first place, arguably got Sean killed, took Arthur and Bill to rob a stagecoach that ended up being very heavily guarded, and pushed Dutch to meet with and eventually murder Leviticus Cornwall on his yacht in Annesburg, something else that the present gang members barely made it out of alive. After the Lemoyne bank robbery fiasco and the Guarma detour, Micah became an informant for the Pinkertons and began feeding them information about the gang. His control over Dutch continued to grow as he convinced Dutch not to save Abigail after she was kidnapped by the Pinkertons, and he agreed, deciding that she was just not worth the risk, something which Arthur and Sadie disagreed with, and went to get her themselves, and during this mission learned that Micah had been the rat all along. After a confrontation with the Pinkertons, Micah was ultimately responsible for Arthur's death and escapes, aiming to create his own gang with some of his old criminal friends. This new gang grew in power and notoriety, with rumors saying that Micah personally killed over 24 lawmen, and newspapers claiming that Micah's acts of lawlessness rivaled those of Van der Linde himself. At some point, he tried to kill one of his gang members named Cleet, who had attempted to stop Micah from killing a young girl, and eventually reunited with Dutch, together recovering the money from the Blackwater Massacre. By 1907, he and his gang had made their headquarters on Mount Hagen. When John Marston and Sadie Adler arrived to execute him, Micah made an attempt to hold Sadie hostage and negotiate his survival, believing he could trust Dutch to defend him, but he forgot that no one could trust Dutch, and was shot in the chest for his blunder. At last, it would be John who delivered the killing blow, leaving Micah's corpse to freeze in the snow. Next, we have Bill Williamson.
You must think I was born yesterday. You always did think I was an idiot.
That ain't fair, Bill. You were as my brother. I've come to try to save you.
Oh. Do I look like I need saving?
Bill was originally named Marion Williamson, but disliked it so much he pulled Bill out of his last name. His father was, you guessed it, an alcoholic, and Bill got sent to reform school, which did about as much good for him as it did for Sean. He decided to join the Army after school and was assigned to the 15th Infantry, where he went around killing Native Americans for a while. In 1892, he was dishonorably discharged for deviancy and attempted murder, and he soon went back to petty crime, spending most of his time as a drunkard and robber. In 1893, he attempted to rob Dutch, but for whatever reason, Dutch didn't take it that seriously, and according to Bill, cheered him back up and invited him to join the gang, instilling in Bill the same feeling of debt that so many other members had. Much like Arthur, Bill would become an enforcer, and is one of the gang members most often accompanying Arthur on jobs. He and Karen devised the plan to rob the Valentine Bank along with Arthur and Lenny, which was successful monetarily, but had a considerable death toll. His time in the Army made it difficult for him to fulfill his Van der Linde duties in altercations with soldiers multiple times, but his loyalty to Dutch always won in the end. This loyalty was unfaltering, even as Dutch became more and more erratic and the gang began to implode, and he disappeared during the Pinkerton attack on Beaver Hollow, assumedly with Javier, and dropped off the map, remaining at large for some time. By 1911, he had created his own gang and occupied Fort Mercer as his own personal fortress, where he had John Marston shot during a confrontation. This did not have the intended effect, though, and Bill spent the next several months on the run from John and members of law enforcement before a final confrontation at a villa in Escalera, Mexico, belonging to Colonel Agustin Allende. Here, Bill and Allende attempted to escape in an armored stagecoach, but John ultimately caught up to them and executed their bodyguards. Allende decided to betray Bill, bargaining for his life in place of the outlaw, and, in the end, Bill Williamson's life would come to an end when he was shot and killed by John Marston. Next, we have Javier Escuella.
Javier?
Yes.
Javier, will you ride out with Arthur to take a look for John? You're the two best fit men we've got.
Now?
We're pretty worried about him.
I know. The situation were reversed, and he'd look for me.
I'm aware that his name is actually pronounced something more along the lines of Escuella, but it's pronounced Escuela for the entirety of Red Dead 2, so that's what we're going to stick with. Javier was born in Nuevo Paradiso, Mexico, to a strict Catholic mother and a laborer father who was also an alcoholic. If you remember Colonel Allende from like 10 seconds ago, the lands he grew up on were owned by that guy's uncle. At one point, Javier's uncle and 4 other guys tried to get a bunch of villagers stirred up to demand fair wages from old Uncle Allende, and they were all castrated and fed to pigs. I think pretty understandably, this was hard for Javier to just ignore, and his relationship with his mother became strained as she just continued on with peasant life as if nothing had happened after her brother was brutally murdered. These events pushed Javier down a road to become a revolutionary of sorts. Not in the way that he rose up against oppressive forces, but rather in the way that he could just rob people and feel okay about it. If this sounds familiar, Javier thought so too, and found quite a kinship in Dutch van der Linde when the two of them were trying to steal the same chickens in 1895. Javier's affinity for the gang was not just one based on money or desperation like a lot of the others, because while he definitely was grateful for what Dutch had given him, his primary allegiance found root in the ideology of the gang more than anything else. He saw a lot of action as a member of the gang and was part of that robbery we talked about earlier when Karen pulled out the nun costume. During the Blackwater massacre, Javier was one of the few witnesses to Dutch's murder of a young mother named Heidi McCourt, which would kick off the slaughter that followed. He was also especially good at finding little jobs for the gang and was a reliable source of continual income from things like house robberies and horse theft, although he was rarely responsible for the planning of bigger jobs. During the Guarma detour, he was shot and taken captive by Colonel Fusar's soldiers who dragged him behind their horses for a not inconsiderable amount of time. After enduring this and being locked in a cage, he was rescued by Arthur and Dutch and eventually reclaimed his health. During the gang's final collapse in Beaver Hollow, Javier sides with Dutch, but disappears with Bill when the Pinkertons attack. He retreated to the mountains of Mexico for a while to let things die down and hide out. By 1911, he was working as a hired gun for Colonel Allende, ironic considering his family history with the Allendes. and facilitated Bill Williamson's escape to Nuevo Paradiso, placing the latter under the Colonel's protection. When John Marston rolls in looking for Javier, the Colonel decides to use the situation to his advantage, and sends him to fight the rebels he had been battling and their leader Abraham Reyes. And if John does this, Allende will hand Javier over. Of course, there was no plan of ever handing Javier over, and John was eventually betrayed by the Mexican army. Turns out he didn't need the Colonel's help anyway, because he found Javier in the military fort El Presidio, where he would try to convince John to let him go, offering to give him the location of Bill and even Dutch in exchange for his freedom. In the end, these pleas fell on deaf ears, and Javier would also meet his end at the gun of John Marston. The last time anyone saw his body, it was being driven away in the back of a government car driven by agents Ross and Fordham. Next, we have John Marston.
Put the gun down, Americano.
¡Ya, mátalo! ¡Dejen mi hombre!
¡Mierda!
¡Ay, Dios mío!
Santa Maria!
So you want to settle this now, friend? Or you want me to shoot you in the head right now for that poor girl?
John was the son of an Irish immigrant and a prostitute who died while giving birth to him. In 1881, his father died in a bar fight in Chicago when he was only 8 years old. He spent a few hard years at an orphanage, but would run away to live on the streets, a life probably safer considering the state of orphanages in 1880s Chicago. When he was 11, John committed his first murder, and though he claims it was not his fault, he struggled on with the guilt of what he had done. In 1885, some Illinois homesteaders caught him stealing and decided that justice demanded the lynching of a 12-year-old. But thankfully, Dutch was passing through about the same time and managed to avert the hanging. After this, we see the story that has been repeated countless times thus far. Dutch invited him to join the gang and took him under his wing as a father figure, teaching him the finer things of life while the gang taught him the more violent things, and through this, building an incredibly effective crime machine. Much like Javier, John believed that they were burdened with righteous purpose, and truly thought of Dutch as the rugged philosopher of a brutal age. The gang generally saw John as Dutch's favorite, describing him as the golden boy who would be repeatedly forgiven no matter how grave his transgressions. In 1895, Abigail Roberts joined the gang and eventually fell in love with John, later giving birth to their son Jack. As we talked about earlier, John had a hard time with this, both because he doubted Jack's heritage, considering Abigail had slept with most of the male members of the gang before sticking around with him, and because he doubted his own abilities to raise a child. Around 1886, he left the gang for a year, and despite being welcomed back by the rest of the senior members upon his return, this choice did not sit well with Arthur and began to drive a steady wedge between the two as time went on. As the gang fled to the mountains following the Blackwater massacre, Micah and John were sent out scouting to find supplies or a place to stay overnight. Micah was back before too long, but when John had been missing for almost 2 days, Abigail started to get a little worried, so Javier and Arthur went out looking for him. At some point, John had gotten lost and attacked by wolves, leading to his horse being mauled to death and the advent of some pretty severe gashes across his face, which would lead to the trademarked scars that defined his appearance from that point onwards. Even though John and Javier were drawn to the gang for similar reasons, they had different reactions to Dutch's actions in Blackwater. While Javier saw Dutch kill Heidi McCourt and remained unshaken in his belief, these actions did not sit well with John, and there was a splinter of doubt planted in his mind that made his interactions with Dutch tense going forward, even if he would occasionally still support him when the gang voiced uncertainties about their leader. As discussed previously, John was not the biggest fan of his son, to the extent that Abigail asked Arthur to take Jack fishing since John would not have anything to do with him. This began to change when Jack was kidnapped in retaliation for the gang's provoking of the Braithwaite family. After this happened, John got pretty outraged, and as they searched for Jack, he began to reflect on his responsibility and poor parenting, leading him to take a more active role in his family's life, inviting Abigail and Jack to stay in his room at Shady Belle upon his safe return. This did not go over well with Dutch, who began to see Abigail as a threat to the gang's structure, trying to pull John away from his old family and toward his new one. Because of this, he began to try and pull them apart himself, but all this did was make John doubt Dutch's choices with increasing vocality. After the failed Lemoyne National Bank heist, John was arrested and taken to Sisika Penitentiary, from where Arthur and Sadie were later able to liberate him and returned to the new camp in Beaver Hollow. During the gang's final job, a train robbery, John was shot in the shoulder and falls from the train, and while Dutch supposedly went back to save him, he decided that it would be better if John was left to die and chose to lie to Arthur, saying that he was already long gone when he arrived. John eventually made it back to camp, just in time to escalate the gang's final confrontation to the point of violence, and after the death of Susan Grimshaw, he and Arthur stood alone against the remaining members. As they made their escape from the Pinkertons afterward, Arthur tells John about his family's location just before their horses were shot from under them, and it became clear that there would be no escape. Arthur decided that John had to reach his family at all costs, and to do his best to distract the Pinkertons for as long as he could. The wedge driven between them faded fully at this point, and John was able to recognize that Arthur had always been his brother, and his harshness had always come from a place of loyalty. After the fall of the Van der Linde gang, John and his family wandered the northern states as he continually blew his cover and was forced to move from one place to another to stay free. The remaining parts of his story have already been fairly detailed above, so some parts will be generalized here. He tried to hold down steady jobs before getting hired as a ranch hand, which allowed him to take out the loan to buy Beecher's Hope. Eventually, he and Sadie found Micah's gang on Mount Hagen and, following a standoff, killed Micah and returned to his family where he and Abigail are formally married. The Bureau of Investigation catches wind of the events on Mount Hagen, though, and after finding Micah's frozen corpse, began a manhunt for the people responsible. One important detail here is that between 1907 and 1911, John and Abigail had a daughter who died very young of unknown causes, that John references in a conversation with Louisa Fortuna, saying, "I have a son at home and a daughter in heaven." Both Abigail and Jack are taken hostage by agents Ross and Fordham, who want to use him to hunt down Bill Williamson in their pursuit of a lawful and civilized West. As we know, this is exactly what John does, executing both Javier Escuella and Bill Williamson. In his final moments, Dutch warned John that the government is not to be trusted and will eventually find a new monster to blame. And for once, he actually was telling the truth, because they would do just that, turning on John in an assault on Beecher's Hope. Here, John Marston, Jack, and Uncle made a final stand against the aggressors, with John making the ultimate sacrifice to save his family from death. He was buried beside Uncle on a ridge overlooking the ranch, with his grave inscribed, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Next, we have Arthur Morgan.
I ain't changed. I'm still a bad man.
Maybe your path isn't changing, Arthur.
My path is coming to an end, Reverend.
I know, son. I know. And I know that you will face your destiny like a man, like a warrior. Because that's what you are.
That's all I am. A fighter, a killer, and a crazy man.
Arthur lost his mother early in life to unknown causes, and his father, who was, yes, you guessed it, a petty criminal, was arrested for larceny when he was just 11 years old. And he later watched his father die, which, despite their tenuous relationship, affected him pretty deeply, and he would keep a picture of his father as well as his hat. In 1877, Arthur met Dutch and Hosea and became one of the first members of the gang, as well as Dutch's first protege, buying into the idea of a life free of civilization, bought through violence that so many future members would come to believe after him. There was a time when Arthur was sent out fishing and returned with these 3 huge fish, and the gang was celebrating him, but the next week it was revealed that he had actually just bought them from a fishmonger and passed them off as his own work. When he was 22, Arthur met 12-year-old John Marston, and Dutch began to see them both as his favorite sons and most loyal soldiers. Arthur also met a girl named Mary Gillis around this time, and the two would fall deeply in love, but were ultimately forced apart by his life of crime and her father's disapproval. He did befriend her younger brother Jamie, though, who he taught horseback riding. One of the defining events of his life would take place some years later, though, when he met a waitress named Eliza. Eliza would become pregnant with their son, Isaac, who Arthur would make an effort to see regularly. She knew who he was and what he did, and according to him, he made no promises to them that he couldn't keep. However, his absence would eventually prove to have consequences when he returned one day to find 2 crosses waiting for him outside their home. Both Eliza and Isaac had been killed in a robbery for just $10. This pain would stay with him for the rest of his life, and was one of the reasons he resented John's irresponsibility toward his own family so much. A part of him always wishing he could have done better for the people he loved. It was chiefly this event that led Arthur to completely give up on ever being happy, choosing, in his own words, to do his best to help others be happy instead. The gang also had a dog named Copper at one point that Arthur grew pretty close to, and though he was difficult to control, he seemed to see the dog as a familiar spirit. And then, in 1898, while the gang was in Montana, Copper ate a huge amount of salmon that was being prepared for a gang feast and died thereafter. So yes, sad, but it looks like he may have saved everyone else from eating the fish and succumbing to whatever was wrong with them as well. Or it was just flatworms. That wouldn't have affected the humans anyway. The amount of crimes, big and small, that Arthur committed on behalf of the gang would take hours to recount, and a lot of the major ones will be covered in the sections about the story of the gang as a whole, so some will be generalized with the intention of returning to them later. But this goes to show just how intrinsic Arthur was to the ecosystem of the group, not only to support the camp, but also as Dutch's lead enforcer and debt collector. That second one would be what would ultimately seal his fate, though, when Leopold Strauss would send him to retrieve the owed funds of a man named Thomas Downs. Now, Thomas was a guy who tried to do his best around Valentine as a fundraiser for the charitable organization of New Hanover, and seemed to be a pretty stand-up guy. But he wasn't doing too good in the money department and took out a loan from Strauss, likely to support his family and struggling ranch. These were not Thomas's only worries though, because he was sick. And while his family did not seem to know exactly what he was sick with, Arthur would have the misfortune of finding out. Thomas Downs was suffering from tuberculosis and, during their confrontation over the outstanding loan, violently coughed up blood, some of which landed in Arthur's mouth. He doesn't take this too well and probably would have beaten Thomas to death if his wife Edith hadn't intervened. He took some stuff from the house and left, and Thomas died not long after, probably unrelated to the beating, but definitely didn't help. Edith Downs and her son Archie were left destitute, and they eventually moved to a mining town of Ansburg, where she worked as a prostitute to get by. The Downs families seem like minor characters, and in terms of their presence in the story of the gang, they are, but in terms of impact on Arthur's life, they are pivotal. Arthur's sickness never got better. In fact, it got significantly worse, the first signs of its severity becoming clear after the Guarma detour. Tuberculosis affected Arthur in much the same way that Jack's kidnapping affected John. He started to reevaluate his choices and weigh the morality of the life he had led. In both cases, these lives had been led in service to Dutch's gospel of a more civilized society, and when legitimate thought was applied to this, that gospel began to wear thin as the future lost the illusions of its infinity and became a question of legacy rather than glory. Over the course of this sickness, Arthur began to see things. Specifically, he began to see a deer, or more specifically, a buck. There are a lot of meanings that deer in general carry across much folklore, and while these similes may all be accurate, to Arthur the buck seems to represent freedom, innocence, and the peaceful life that he would never have. In Celtic mythology, the deer of the Hallstatt period was a symbol of ownership and sacrifice, both intrinsic to Arthur's final acts, choosing to sacrifice everything and finally taking back ownership of his life. In the end, Arthur repaid Edith Downs and her son enough money to get out of Annesburg, and they eventually went on to enjoy modest success from what can be seen in 1907. As time went on, it was not that Arthur began to doubt Dutch, like Pearson or Trelawny or some of the others. Instead, his priorities shifted, that was it. He started to care less about gain and more about what value he was able to contribute and what harm he was able to avert. The most intense symptom of this was when he directly disobeyed Dutch and went to save Abigail from captivity at the hands of the Pinkertons. As discussed earlier, Dutch was done with both John and his family at this point, and any help he could have in getting rid of them was welcome, so he and Micah decided to leave her with them, presumably to die. Arthur and Sadie went to save her, of course, and ended up in a standoff with Agent Milton, who Abigail later executed. Arthur carried the news of Micah's betrayal back to camp and set in action the conflict that would destroy the gang once and for all. Once the Pinkertons attacked, and John and Arthur fled, Arthur is faced with one final choice: the money or John. He had ample option to go back for Dutch's money stash hidden in a cavern in Beaver Hollow, or stay and make sure John got to safety and his family. After a final confrontation with Micah, Arthur was mortally wounded. And while he had the chance to kill Micah, he was stopped by Dutch, who eventually walks away, abandoning both of them. Micah understood that his work was done at that point and left Arthur to die. Finally, in a moment of peace, Arthur gave in to death at the edge of a cliff, watching one final sunrise. Next is Hosea Matthews.
Gentlemen, my name is Melvin. That's my brother Fenton. He's a bit funny, but boy, can he pour drinks fast. For the next 30 minutes, The drinks in this here bar, in this here town, are entirely free. The only rule is that you gotta drink them. So hurry up, put old Fenton to work. Don't get him mad, though. His mama made him mad, and we buried her. Poor thing.
Hosea grew up with dreams of being a comedian and worked as a stage actor for some time before eventually turning to a life of petty crime. During one of these petty crimes, he was caught stealing a chicken, and what he called a Hill County sheriff decided to hang him. Thankfully, the townspeople didn't really think attempted chicken theft deserved the death penalty, and a riot broke out, resulting in them hanging the sheriff instead and Hosea escaping. In the mid-1870s, he was on the road to Chicago and stopped to rest at a campfire where he met Dutch, who he attempted to con and rob, and who was also attempting to con and rob him. For whatever reason, they did not end up killing each other and instead decided to rob and con people together. One of their first major jobs was to scam the people of Kettering, Ohio by posing as merchants from far away and getting them to invest in a fake Portuguese shipping company. The law wasn't too happy about it and they were eventually arrested, but later escaped imprisonment. Not long after, they met Arthur Morgan and with this trio in place, began building the idea of a gang more than just a partnership. At some point, Hosea married Bessie, and, well, we know how that went. Hosea became the general organizer of the gang, working with Dutch to make executive decisions, planning major jobs, and negotiating with outside parties. In situations of diplomacy, it was generally Hosea who took control and was the voice of reason in contrast to Dutch's hot-headedness. An example of this was his caution against the kidnapping of Angelo Bronte, which would have been a very good thing to avoid considering it added both to John's doubt and their state of wantedness by the law. Shortly after, Hosea took part in the planning and execution of the Lemoyne National Bank heist, planning a distraction that would cover their robbery. But as we know, the bank job was a setup and Pinkertons showed up almost immediately, at which point Hosea was captured by Agent Milton. Dutch attempted to bargain with Milton, but that didn't go too well. He pushed Hosea away from him and shot him in the chest, telling Dutch that his death was their deal. Both his and Lenny's bodies were eventually recovered from the Saint Denis morgue and buried together in Blue Water Marsh. Hosea's death was bad for the gang in more ways than just losing a strategist and con man, though. Without a counterbalance to his antics, there was no one for Dutch to take counsel with or to rein him in when he got out of control. This loss, almost more than anything else, would be the catalyst to begin the gang's disintegration. And finally, we have Dutch van der Linde.
We have a plan. My friends. My loved ones. A plan. It is a real plan. We are gonna leave this place and we are gonna find our own paradise, our own heaven. Tahiti, Fiji, Australia, the real new world. Not this God-forsaken dump that all of Europe's detritus has acted out its peasants' vengeance on. We are gonna be free! Free.
Dutch was born to an English mother and a Dutch father in the mid-1850s. His father fought for the Union in the Civil War and would be killed in a battle somewhere near Philadelphia, which, although he was not that old at the time, began a lifelong hatred of Southerners. He had a tempestuous relationship with his mother that escalated in his running away from home at 15 and never seeing his mother again since she died sometime during his absence, and he only found out that she was dead at all through an uncle a few years afterwards. Having no one to bring him up, he took charge of his own education, desiring to be a man of art and culture more than just violence and crime, with a fixation on absolute personal freedom. In pursuit of these, he lived a life of random crimes for a while before heading to Chicago, on the road to which he met Hosea. And not long after Arthur, and well, you know from there, he began to fashion himself a reputation as a Robin Hood-like character due to some of the gang's actions on an early bank robbery that we will talk about in the next section. And overall, he began to see himself as an embodiment of what the West had been, or at least an idealized version of it. This romantic presence brought the gang together under his leadership, and the ideas he propagated of a savage utopia, which they could only win through as much death as possible. By the time 1899 rolled in, though, he was starting to get shaky on this idea, as the West became less wild and the world he dreamt of less realistic. A lot of Dutch's actions and ideas have already been talked about and are going to be talked about again in the next section. so I'm not going to get repetitive here. We're going to focus on the things about Dutch that we have not yet talked about, and his actions that have not yet been revisited. An important event to note occurred during the Battle of the Heartland oil fields between the Wapiti Indians and the Army. See, during this, Arthur and Dutch go into the warehouse there to search for state bonds because, of course they have to make money off this somehow. But after Dutch finds the bonds, Arthur is incapacitated briefly by a pipe that bursts next to him. Seeing this, Dutch decides to leave him to the soldiers and gets out of there. Now, Arthur is saved by Eagle Flies, who dies in the act of saving him, but what really matters is that Dutch had started adopting this mindset of just cutting people loose at the slightest provocation, something which he had before heavily criticized his rival Como Driscoll for doing with his own gang members. Early in the gang's lifespan, this would have been unthinkable. Just consider how many people he immediately sent to save Sean MacGuire when he heard of his captivity with the bounty hunters. But something happened after Guarma and after Hosea died. Dutch just stopped caring as much. There were times when he was going to leave Abigail, Arthur, and John to die on separate occasions, and those last two he supposedly cared about like they were his own sons. Dutch, of course, denies not going back for Arthur later, but it doesn't matter. The seed was planted. And it makes it that much easier for Arthur to believe John when he returns to the Beaver Hollow camp saying that Dutch had left him for dead during the Army payroll train heist. After his duel with Micah, Arthur tries to convince Dutch of the other man's traitorous nature, but Dutch just walks away in shock, unable to believe that he had brought the gang he spent his life building to ruin. Like so many leaders, there was a part of him that always thought the gang would survive whatever came, and no matter how many people left, it would always come back stronger like it always had. What he forgot was that it wasn't just the numbers, it was the people that made the Vanderlinde gang what it was. After Beaver Hollow, Dutch went on the run, partaking in a bungled robbery in 1906, which went so badly that newspapers were reporting he died in a fire following the attempt. He and Micah did manage to get back to Blackwater and retrieve the ferry heist money though, taking it to their hideout on Mount Hagen. Of course, as we know, John, Sadie, and Charles showed up and wrecked the place, and despite seeming to be on Micah's side, Dutch shoots him in the chest, saving Sadie's life. There could be a number of reasons for this choice, and it may even seem out of character, but I think there was still a part of Dutch that saw John like a son, at least at that point, and the part that resented Micah for the collapse of the gang. After this, he left though, ignoring John's attempts to thank him, but he purposely left behind the Blackwater heist money, which was clearly enough to bring Sadie, Charles, and the Marston family financial stability for the foreseeable future. In 1911, he resurfaced at the head of a new gang of disaffected native youth, who he had organized in their shared hatred of authority and appetite for violence against oppression. The Bureau of Investigation coerced John to go and find him, and he does eventually in the Blackwater Bank, where Dutch takes a woman hostage who he murders to make his escape. In the bank, Dutch admits that it was a mistake to leave John for dead on the train, but also condemns his marriage to Abigail, calling her a whore. Together with the army, John assaults Dutch's fortress Cockney. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. It's been a really long time since I've played Red Dead 1, I'll be honest with you. And Dutch overcomes any previous love for his prodigal son, trying to kill him with a Browning machine gun. This doesn't work though, and after a lengthy chase, John confronts Dutch at the edge of a cliff. Here, Dutch reflects on his situation and the changing times, acknowledging that his fight against societal change was always in vain, but it was in his nature to fight it, and he had no choice despite that absurdism. He wants John to know that the government is not to be trusted, and that lawmen are killers just like outlaws, but ultimately will not allow himself to be taken into custody. As he steps off the cliff, he tells John that their time has passed and falls to his death. Agent Ross shot his corpse with a pistol after recovering it to make it look like John shot him under the claim that it would look better in the report that way. As with many things, Dutch was correct in concept, if not in practice, because shortly after, the government would indeed betray and kill John Marston. And with him, the final remnant of the Vanderlinde gang would be lost to time. So those are the 29 members of the Vanderlinde gang. Now we put all of these together into the overarching timeline of the gang itself and go through the events of its history. In the mid-1870s, Dutch and Hosea met on their way to Chicago at a roadside campfire, where they tried to rob each other and decided to work together as con men, playing on each other's strengths. Their partnership was what could first be called the Vanderlinde gang, though it would not be a proper gang until a bit later on. Not long after this, Hosea met Bessie, who he would later marry. They adopted Robin Hood-like roles and began giving some of what they stole to the poor in pursuit of a savage utopia. The first major job the two would undertake was in Kettering, Ohio in 1877, when they conned 12 people into investment in a fictional Portuguese shipping company and got almost $300 before being arrested. Somehow they escaped their jail cell, tying up and robbing Kettering's sheriff in their departure. Later that same year, they met Arthur Borgen and began the task of converting him from delinquent youth to delinquent adult. Dutch's new lover, Susan Grimshaw, also joined the gang about this time, as did the ill-fated dog, Copper. After this was the period in which Hosea left the gang to settle down with Bessie, moving somewhere near the Grizzlies for a time, before eventually being pulled back into his old ways. Dutch traded a relationship with Susan for one with a new woman named Annabelle, although Susan thankfully elected to stay with the gang. In 1885, they came upon a group of homesteaders in Illinois about to lynch a 12-year-old John Marston for stealing from them and rescued him. Thus began the education of another promising youth in the ways of the criminal, but also some actual education, as Dutch would give him and Arthur classic literature to read so that they may sharpen their minds. 2 years later, the gang would commit their first major robbery at Lee and Hoyt Banking House, with Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur holding up the attendants for $5,000 in gold. After the robbery, they went through the poorer parts of the town, passing out money to those they found, further establishing the noble highwayman status that Dutch had always wanted. This is when I would say they became a real gang, because there were newspapers writing about that robbery and the events afterward, and for the first time, Dutch was a wanted man by name with a bounty for his arrest. Before that, it was just that tall guy with the mustache who pickpocketed the ranch hand, but now it was robber and crime family leader Dutch van der Linde. At some point in this era, Dutch and Colm O'Driscoll became tenuous allies, working together for greater gain, but ultimately disliking everything fundamental about each other. While the exact reasons are unknown, Dutch killed Colm's brother, which, pretty reasonably didn't go over well, and Colm retaliated by killing Annabelle. This probably was not an equal reaction though, because Colm admitted later that he never really liked his brother that much to begin with, but it was probably a retaliation for the sake of saving face rather than one spurred on by rage. This would create a feud between the two gangs that would continue for about a decade. There are sparse details in the gang's story between the bank robbery in 1887 and their arrival in Montana in 1898. But there were three major things that occurred. First was Dutch's change in mindset. If his earlier outlook of taking from the rich and giving to the poor seemed foreign to the Dutch scene in 1899, that's because it was. While he began as a noble warrior against civilization, even going so far as to berate Arthur for robbing a poor man's house because it made them no better than the people they fought against, civilization always wins, and the frontier was slipping away before his eyes. In this realization, many of the gang's moral inhibitions began to falter, and he allowed more and more actions that he earlier would have condemned. The second was likely tied to the first, and this was the 36 bank robberies that the gang partook in over this time, winning both Arthur and Hosea their own bounties and some other members with them. Third was a huge increase in recruitment. Over those 12 years, the gang was joined by the Callander Brothers, Karen Jones, Mary-Beth Gaskill, Tilly Jackson, Simon Pearson, Leopold Strauss, Reverend Swanson, Uncle, Sean MacGuire, Molly O'Shea, and Josiah Trelawny. That unnamed member we talked about in the beginning also came and went during this time as well. There are some who have exact dates of arrival, like Bill Williamson in 1893, Abigail Roberts in 1894, and Javier Escuella in 1895. In the mid-90s, Arthur, Karen, and Javier did that bank robbery we talked about earlier, where Karen dressed up like a nun with pistols concealed under her robe, another strange method of robbery that added to the gang's mystique in the public eye. In 1896, John Marston left the gang and his year-old son to go off and mope for a while, a choice which drove a wedge between him and Arthur for the rest of their time together in spite of John's return in 1897. By 1898, the gang was getting a lot of heat and decided to disappear into Montana to throw off any pursuers, and this was when Hosea caught the salmon and Copper ate them raw, falling fatally ill afterward. During that winter, they sheltered in the foothills of the Grizzlies, and were about as close to Dutch's savage utopia as they ever would be. There was food, no one could find them, they were surrounded by nature, and were able to live off their own resources. Either Dutch thought the law was getting close or he just got bored, but either way, he put them back on the road after that winter, pushing farther into the Grizzlies. During this period, the gang picked up Lenny Summers, Charles Smith, Jenny Kirk, and Micah Bell. By April of 1899, they were in the West Elizabeth region and set up camp outside the town of Blackwater, where they set about the usual business of finding jobs, sussing out leads, and getting poor people to take out as many loans as possible. It was here that Micah convinced Dutch to set his sights on a ferry, carrying $150,000 of bank money. The heist went smoothly at first, with no major resistance in reaching the money. However, agents of the Pinkerton Detective Agency showed up far faster than expected, and a massive gunfight broke out. While the details of this gunfight are shaky, the results are not. John Marston, the Callander brothers, and Jenny Kirk were shot, the latter three fatally, and Sean MacGuire was taken into custody by Ike Skelding's bounty hunters. Seeing the tides turn, Dutch and Hosea decided to hide the money somewhere in Blackwater and fled with the surviving gang members into the mountains of Amberino, successfully losing their pursuers in a blizzard. There is one other note about the robbery that's important to mention though. During the heist, Dutch murdered a young mother, Heidi McCourt, by shooting her in the head. From what I can find, it was only witnessed by Micah, John, and Javier, and the latter two did not take a good view of it. As they made their way into the mountains, Javier told Arthur that Dutch killed her in a bad way, but seems to excuse this by saying that it was also a bad situation. You can see just how much of a bad way this was when the strange man, who is himself an interesting mystery, but not one we will discuss here, recalls it with John saying,
"She was a girl Dutch Vanderlyn shot in the head on that raid on the ferry a few years back. Same one you got shot on. Pretty girl, until her eye was hanging out by a thread of tendon and her brain was plastered over a wall."
This image haunted John, and he began to relate it to a growing distrust in Dutch's judgment, believing that he only killed her because Micah encouraged it. And it didn't help that Dutch excused the entire thing later by saying he did what he had to do in order to survive. An educated guess would say that Heidi was probably a hostage during their escape, since we already know that Dutch has a habit of taking women hostage and killing them at the last second, as seen in the case of Muriel Scranton 12 years later in the bank of the same city. While in the mountains, the gang finds Sadie Adler and captured Kieran Duffy after an altercation with the O'Driscolls. Using information found in this altercation, they hold up a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwall and find $1,000 in bonds. As the weather warmed, the Vanderlyn gang left the mountains and set up camp south of Valentine in a place called Horseshoe Overlook. During their stay here, they came across Josiah Trelawny, who revealed that Sean MacGuire was still in Ike Skelding's custody outside of Blackwater, and would soon be turned over to state imprisonment by way of riverboat. Dutch would eventually send a group to forcibly free him. It was also around this time that Micah Bell got arrested in Strawberry while on patrol with Lenny, and Arthur would have to go reluctantly and free him as well. The gang's time at Horseshoe Overlook would come to an end when Leviticus Cornwall confronted Dutch at a small saloon in Valentine, kicking off a shootout, and they pretty much had no choice but to get out of town for a while, and a new camp would be set up on the banks of Flatiron Lake at a place called Clemens Point. In Clemens Point and the town of Rhodes, the Vanderlyn gang would get in pretty deep because they tried to play the locals against each other. There were two feuding families in Rhodes, the Greys and the Braithwaites, who were fighting over gold lost before the Civil War, each believing the other to have stolen it. This effort to pit the two sides against each other included a lot of petty crimes, including moonshine theft, horse theft, the burning of some tobacco fields, and just a lot of violence overall. Some enforcers from the gang also returned to Valentine to rob the bank, a heist which went very well and netted some pretty intense profits. It was only possible to keep the families at each other for so long though. Eventually, Dutch overplayed his hand and the Greys figured out what was going on, and they were not too happy about it. So they laid a trap, and when Arthur, Bill, Sean, and Micah went to talk to Sheriff Gray about a protection job, they ambushed the gang members, starting by shooting Sean directly between the eyes and killing him instantly. Arthur especially did not take this too well and killed pretty much everyone in the town, including the sheriff and his deputies. The Braithwaites had also become aware of the manipulations and made their own retaliations by kidnapping John Marston's son, Jack. In this, they made the same mistake that the Greys had made before them. Both families believed that when it came down to it, they could overpower the Vanderlyn gang and make them pay for their hubris. This was not the case. Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, Lenny, Charles, Hosea, and John went to Braithwaite Manor and executed every last one of them, and confronted the matriarch, Catherine Braithwaite, who revealed that they sold Jack to Saint Denis crime lord Angelo Bronte. After learning this, the gang set fire to the house with her inside. Upon confronting Angelo Bronte, he was pretty chill about everything, to be honest, and just sent Arthur and John to clear out some grave robbers from the Saint Denis Cemetery before giving Jack back. It was shortly after this that Tilly was briefly kidnapped by the Foreman brothers. Kieran Duffy also met his end during this time, sent decapitated into the camp at Shady Bell, tied to a horse with his head literally in his hands. A shootout with the O'Driscolls followed shortly after, but the attackers were repelled. The gang also committed a fairly successful riverboat robbery during this time as well, and made an attempt at a trolley station robbery that did not end so well. They had gotten the lead from Bronte, and it turned out to be a lie when the station had little to no money, and an ambush by the law led to a chase through the city that ended in a trolley crash. Dutch got pretty angry about this and decided to raid Bronte's house and take him out to a swamp. Once in the swamp, Bronte harassed him even further, and Dutch snapped, drowning the crime lord and throwing his body out of their boat to be eaten by alligators. Again, John did not take this violence well, and again, Dutch excused his actions as what needed to be done. It was also around this time that Molly O'Shea abandoned the Shady Bell and disappeared, likely becoming disenchanted with Dutch as a result of his mental and moral decline. In spite of these internal disagreements, this was probably the peak of the gang's power. With the city of Saint Denis under their heel, the law far behind them, a safe and hidden camp, and plenty of money. But as with most peaks, this would not last for long. For their next heist, the Van der Linde gang chose to rob the Lemoyne National Bank, an event which would be the beginning of the end. The robbery didn't go too well, with both Hosea and Lenny being killed, John arrested, and the others barely able to escape alive. They snuck through the docks and got on a boat bound for Cuba. But this also would not go well, and the boat got hit by a storm and crashed. The survivors of this crash would wash up in Guarma, where they were promptly arrested by Alberto Fusar's soldiers. After some altercations between rebels and the soldiers, Dutch, Arthur, Micah, Bill, and Javier are able to find a boat captain they can trust and return to the mainland. Two things become apparent upon their arrival. The first is that Arthur has tuberculosis, and there is little hope that he will live much longer. The second is that the Pinkertons are very close, staging an attack at the gang's temporary hideout in Lakay, forcing them to relocate to a place called Beaver Hollow. To capture Beaver Hollow, Dutch and Arthur had to drive out its former inhabitants, the Murphy brood, who put up a little bit of a fight, but ultimately were driven out. Not long after setting up camp, Uncle brought in a drunk Molly O'Shea, and she was claiming that it was her who had been giving the Pinkertons information, and Dutch got pretty angry and seemed prepared to shoot her, but Arthur managed to calm him down. Didn't matter too much though, because Susan Grimshaw obliterated her with a shotgun, saying she knew the rules, and had Pearson and Bill burn her corpse. Karen and Mary-Beth didn't like this too well, with Karen accusing Susan of being a murderer, and Mary-Beth saying that the killing was needless, as Molly was just in love and would have said anything. Arthur and Sadie facilitated John Marston's escape from Sisika Penitentiary in what seemed to be a victory for everyone, but Dutch kind of loses his mind and starts screaming at John and Sadie upon their return. After this, things began to decline. The gang was subdivided into the anti-Dutch and pro-Dutch camps, and they fell into a sort of McCarthyism, always trying to suss out the doubters from the believers. Dutch was becoming ever more dedicated to their escape from the region and decided to confront the gang's biggest enemy, Leviticus Cornwall, so that he may demand $10,000, Cornwall's boat, and safe passage in return for sparing his family. Obviously, he refused this, and Dutch executed him, setting off a shootout across the docks of Annisburg. From this point, there are two major goals for the Van der Linde gang. First, start a war between the army and the Wapiti Indian tribe to take heat off them so they can make an escape. Second, blow up Bacchus Bridge and steal payroll money from an army train. The war was started with an attack on the Cornwall oil refinery, which went off mostly without issue, although Arthur did see Dutch leaving for dead like we talked about earlier, something else which pushed them even further apart. After this is when Charles decides to stay with the Wapiti tribe and not come back to the gang. Tensions were getting pretty high at this point, and Uncle, Mary-Beth, Pearson, and Karen all decided it was time to leave, following a previously departed Josiah Trelawny. During the lead up to the train robbery, Arthur counsels John to take his family and leave the gang while he is still able to do so. This was good advice, because during the robbery, John got shot and fell off the train, leading Dutch to go and look for him, only to leave him for dead, saying that once again, there was just nothing else he could do. After getting back to camp, he also decides that Abigail's recent kidnapping may be an unexpected blessing and refuses to go and save her from the Pinkertons. After Tilly brought them the news of the abduction, Arthur tells her to leave and make a better life for herself, and she does, taking Jack with her. As we know, Arthur and Sadie do not abandon their friend and go to intervene, a choice which leads to the demise of Agent Milton, and the revelation that Micah was the traitor all along. On the way back, Arthur sends Sadie and Abigail to find Jack and Tilly, and returns to camp to confront Micah. The camp at Beaver Hollow wasn't much of a camp at this point because there wasn't much of a gang to occupy it. Only Bill, Susan, Dutch, Micah, Joe, and Cleet remained. This would be important since most of these people were Micah's friends before anyone else's. Micah denies the accusations, of course, and things may have de-escalated if John hadn't arrived at that same time, revealing Dutch's lies from earlier in his attempt to leave John for dead. This pushed Susan Grimshaw, the only remaining doubter, over the edge and began a standoff between her, Arthur, and John, and literally everyone else. Javier returns, announcing the Pinkertons approaching, and this distracted Susan long enough for Micah to shoot and kill her. Dutch was finally over the edge at this point and goes guns out, demanding to know who's betraying him and who's loyal. This leads everyone to unite behind Dutch, except his two favorite sons. As the Pinkertons attack, everyone scatters. But even as they attempt to escape into the mountains, it becomes clear to John and Arthur that they are fully surrounded, and there is no way for both of them to make it out alive. At this point, Arthur made the choice to face the Pinkertons alone, doing what he could to make sure John got to safety and back to his family. After this, Micah arrived and had one final battle with Arthur, after which Dutch also arrived, but only to deny his son yet again in his dying hour and walked away. Unable to believe that his lifetime of dreams and schemes, visions of savage utopia, had come to this. With that final betrayal came the true end of the Van der Linde gang. After the gang disbanded, you already know what happened, but we'll go through a short list here just to recap. Strauss was captured and eventually killed by the Pinkertons after not giving up information about the gang. Micah went on to make his own gang, later killed by John Marston. Javier disappeared into the mountains of Mexico and became a hitman, later killed by John Marston. Bill went off the radar for a while, but would eventually resurface with the Williamson gang in New Austin, and, you guessed it, later killed by John Marston. Dutch also went into the shadows for a few years, took part in a failed robbery, and was presumed dead until he rejoined with Micah, and technically he wasn't killed by John Marston, but his death was both pinned on and facilitated by John. Uncle ended up in Beecher's Hope, helping build up the ranch and eventually facing an army attack alongside John and Jack. John worked for his remaining years on his ranch, trying to make a life for him and his family, but would eventually be forced to hunt down his former fellow gang members in order to save his family. He too would perish in an army attack at Beecher's Hope. Charles became a fighter for a while in Saint Denis, before assisting John in finding Micah. After John and Abigail's wedding, he was never seen again, and it's assumed that he returned to Canada. Sadie became a bounty hunter for a while and left after the wedding to assumedly leave the country, as she had talked about, but no one really knows. Mary-Beth became a romance author under the pen name Leslie Dupont. Tilly moved to Saint Denis, married a lawyer, and got rich. Karen disappeared, but it was assumed that she never recovered from the gang's destruction and was consumed by her alcoholism. Trelawny went back to living with his family in the safety of Saint Denis, and Pearson moved to Rhodes, where he became the proprietor of the Rhodes General Store, and at some point got married, living out his days in relative peace. The legacy of the Van der Linde gang was first one of dread and violence, but as the 20th century progressed, it was romanticized, becoming the subject of pulpy novels and folk songs. A group of rogues fighting against the world in the final moments of another century. In a way, Dutch got what he finally wanted, to be seen as a noble hero of the dying West, a beacon of the world that had been and never would be again. Arthur, to me, really embodies the Van der Linde gang as a whole. When he was young and rebellious, so was the gang. When he was full of noble dreams, lofty ambitions, and fleeting visions of heroism, so was the gang. As he became older and more serious, weighed down by the uncomfortable realities of life, As he watched the future transform from an infinite frontier to a few uncertain paths, so did the gang. And finally, when Arthur got sick and began to fade, the gang got sick and began to fade. He was there in its earliest days, and his death would signal its end. He was a fixture of a different time, of a Wild West once so fierce and full of rage, now cooling in the last light of day. They talked so often about the new world arriving to invade the old, but he would not live to see it. His life ending in the same century it began, never to see civilization's final victory over his savage utopia.